Hi, Glenn. How are you doing?
Doing well. Glenn Loury here, The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. Happy to be speaking with my colleague, friend, John McWhorter, Columbia University, Time Magazine. Any other credentials you need to have announced here, John?
Well, Time Magazine is actually over. I have moved to the Daily Beast now, so I'm with them every week,
Oh,
and I
a,
think
wi-
that's a better page to be on.
a
So yeah,
weekly a weekly columnist at the Daily Beast. The Daily Beast is better than Time Magazine. Now, 10 years ago, I don't think anyone would have said that.
yeah, and I was on technically Time Ideas, and some nice things go on at Time Ideas, but the Daily Beast is a kicky, newish publication. And yeah, to tell you the truth, on Time Ideas, and I don't care who sees this, it was too easy based on the physical nature of the site to get lost. Whereas with the Daily Beast, you actually have what you write featured. So yeah, I've been very happy. So that's where I am at this point. So I'll be writing my column for them today. Come to think of it.
Okay.
So,
What are
where
you
are
going?
you and I today?
Well, I think you and I are going to be talking about race and politics. I think, in particular, we're going to be talking about whether or not President Obama's race has been held against him to the extent that it's impeded his ability to function as president of the United States, as some commentators and pundits are beginning to allege, and
Hmm.
so on. I think that's our agenda. But I thought we might just check in first because it's been, I don't know, 6 weeks since we talked, and I'm just wondering how you're doing. You have another kid on the way. Is it okay for me to tell people that since I've already
There
done so?
is. That's okay. Jane Hamilton McWhorter will be born in January, and so yeah, that is
Wow.
gonna happen. It's gonna be very interesting. The new responsibilities of parenting on top of trying to be a teacher, but I think I'll get through it. And yeah, I and my wife are very happy about that. So that is happening.
That's huge,
And
John. That's huge. I mean, that's
yeah, it is.
absolutely mind-boggling. Two kids underfoot, and the older is how old?
She is now 2.5, and so she'll be 3 by the time the next one is born. And it's interesting. I'm beginning to feel more than I did when Dahlia was born 2.5 years ago that I'm doing this at an older age than many people. Because it's funny, when you're 48, it's when you start getting offers to do things like take temporary positions overseas or to stay somewhere for a month or to help run things and travel. And I can't do a lot of those things because I'm at a child rearing phase that I think a lot of people are at when they're 31. But it's worth it. I had too much to do when I was 31 to be doing what I'm doing now.
Well,
So I
as
can't complain.
as a guy who had with my second wife, my late wife Linda, our children when I was 40 and 43, also 3 years spaced apart.
Hmm.
I can tell you that the kids do travel. I mean, if you want to go to Vienna or if you want to go to Jakarta or any such place like that, it can be done. It just,
Hmm.
it's not like another piece of luggage though. It's like a whole new level of,
Right.
of
And it's funny because Jakarta really was one of the places where we had to turn it down because Dahlia was a tiny baby, and frankly,
yeah,
there were health issues. But it would have been
sure.
great for me in terms of language. But yeah, you can take your children places. But then there's the issue of school. Where you're going to put them to school if you're talking about longer than a few weeks, and things like that. It's going to have to happen to some extent because I'm not going to just stay in New York all the time forever. But it does make you think about it.
All right, let me ask you a question, which is a little bit off of actually, it's a lot off of our agenda, but you just mentioned language, and it happens. I'm just back from Bali,
Mm-hmm.
Indonesia, not far from Jakarta. I didn't get to Jakarta. But
Mm-hmm.
the question has to do with language, and I saw this piece in the New Yorker by a journalist who had traveled into the Amazonian rainforest with this
Dan Everett.
linguist.
Yeah.
Okay, so you know who I'm talking
Mm-hmm.
about, and you know what
Oh yeah.
you know what is going on linguistically with this ethnic group that this tribe, I guess you could call it, of people that he's
The
found.
Piraha, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. And with the challenge to the universal grammar theory of Noam Chomsky, because these particular people in their language seems not to obey the rules, and that has had profound
Mm-hmm.
theoretical implications. And I'm
Oh
just,
yeah.
as a layperson reading this with great interest because the piece is just fascinating in all of the detail and the prodigious amount of fieldwork labor that had to be done in order to put us in the position of knowing as much as we do know about these people's languages and what it implies for the theory of language. I'm just wondering what
Mm-hmm.
what you, distinguished linguist,
Mm.
make of all of this.
Oh wow, that was a rich article, and yeah, it's full of implications. In a nutshell, I would say that what Dan Everett. It's funny, you and I don't usually talk about this side of what I do. What Dan Everett is saying is that these are people who would not say a sentence like, "My mother told me that I can't go there." His idea is that they don't have subordinate clauses. They can
Right.
only say, "My mother said something. Don't go there, Billy." As far as he's concerned, that's the only way you can do it in that language. Now, for the people who say that there's universal grammar, one of the things that they think of as a keystone of that universal nature is that everybody can basically nest one phrase into another and say, "My mother said that I couldn't go there."
Right.
So, it might surprise you to know that I have known people who were really hardcore Chomskyans who talked about Dan Everett as if he were a lower species and claimed that the people who he studied must have been lying to him. I mean, really nasty ad hominem stuff
I
because
am
he's
not
threatening
surprised. I'm not
his theory.
surprised by that. After having read that article, I'm not surprised by that. But go on, please.
No, it's horrible. And so, to tell you the truth, I mean, Dan and I are, chummy colleagues, Facebook friends, etc., and he knows what I think. I am inclined to doubt that those people do not nest phrases within each other. On the other hand, I'm also inclined to doubt that the Chomskyan's idea of universal grammar is something that we actually inherit in our brains. And so I am kind of not with either camp. And not just because I'm some sort of professional contrarian, although many people would say that I was, but because I think in both of those cases there are major questions. But Dan has his heart in the right place, and I don't know, if he were right, it would be very interesting. And to tell you the truth, that business about universal grammar being the particular thing that the Chomskyans suppose, which is this highly abstract algebraic notion of what a language is that doesn't correspond to anything any psychologist or linguist or anthropologist or biologist would think of as language. There needs to be somebody very bright working against it. And Dan is one of those people. I think we need to have a different conception of universal grammar. But that article was a great introduction to what a lot of linguists actually do day to day, as opposed to being grammar police, which is what I think a lot of people understandably think a linguist is. What made you read that article in particular?
My son Nehemiah, a graduate of Columbia University core curriculum, astrophysics major, but he took a lot of culture and social science type stuff while he was there. Said, "Dad, I just found this at longform.com, which is a site that he often visits."
Hmm.
And he said, "You have to read this. I know it will fascinate you." Because I had spent maybe 10 years ago, I wasted an afternoon of his life trying to tell him about Steven Pinker's book, The Language
Oh yeah,
Instinct. He was 13 years old, and I thought he had to know about this great book, because I want my kids all to be rocket
that's a
scientists or
little young
something.
though. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was
yeah.
pushing it. I was pushing it. But he knew that I was interested in the general subject of linguistics and in this deep question of whether or not language facility is a hardwired organ or instinct of the human species evolved over the eons, and the extent to which it's subject to the influence of culture, which seems to me to be
Mm-hmm.
a central theme in Everett's argument.
Mm-hmm.
And so Nehemiah, knowing me as he does, thought, having stumbled upon this article, that he had to make his dad aware of it. That's the only way I would have ever seen it.
I want to say one more thing about that because, frankly, it's a shameless plug for what my latest language book happens to be, which is that there were two prongs to that Everett piece. One was his fight with the universal grammar people, the other one was the language and culture part, where what Dan is implying is that the reason that the Piraha don't count well and that if you ask them questions about numbers and math, they can't answer them to an extent that seems almost counterintuitive to us. His idea
Right.
is that the reason that they can't count is because their language doesn't really have numbers, which it doesn't. They have one word that means kind of like one word that means kind of like two. Then beyond that, they don't go anywhere. My wife and I sometimes call Dahlia, our daughter, a little piraha because she's at the stage where to her there's one of something, there's two of something, and then there's just five, which is any other any other
Yeah.
number. So we say, you little piraha. And it's because of this Everett work. And you know, the idea that they can't do math because their language doesn't have numbers seems to me to be kind of back asswards. It's really in their culture, they don't need to count, so they don't have numbers. So he's saying these people can't do math because their language doesn't have any numbers in it, and that leads to all sorts of things that people say about what people don't do because their language won't let them. When really it's the cultural argument. My new book, The Language Hoax, addresses that whole notion of people's languages channeling their thoughts. And last week it was the ninth most reviewed book in Great Britain, I'm happy to say. And I want to see if we can get it reviewed more here. So that's my plug for myself.
You plugged away, man. You certainly did do that. Now, I know nothing of linguistics, obviously. I'm an economist by training and inclination. But as I read that article, I thought Everett's argument was they don't do abstraction.
Mm,
Numbers are abstract, and therefore they don't do math. That's what I thought the argument. I thought the fundamental core of the argument was not that they didn't have numbers in the language, but that the language was so construed that they were ultra concrete
mm-hmm,
in their communication. And so five, which is an abstract property. You know,
mm-hmm,
you know, there are five melons or there are five stones, but five in and of itself is an abstract property, was simply something
mm-hmm,
that they didn't do because they didn't, you know, he has this scene where the guy is trying to communicate with no language in common
mm-hmm,
about the fact that he doesn't want to be eaten by mosquitoes. So he makes a little symbol with his hand, you know, fluttering as if it were a mosquito coming to his arm to bite.
mm-hmm,
The people who are the speakers of this language look at him blankly, not comprehending what the heck he could be trying to communicate to them, because you
mm-hmm.
know, not because they don't know what mosquitoes are or don't understand about being bitten, but rather because they don't do this kind of abstract way of thinking, something like that. I've already talked too long, but
No, 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 that's a whole other thing.
uh,
Frankly, his larger thesis is that the Piraha are not much into thinking, for example, beyond the present. That the way Dan puts it is that they are uniquely evolved to their environment, which is about hunting things and catching things and doing a certain narrow range of things that a small group of people in the Amazon rainforest might need to do. And that's not only their language. His idea is that the reason that they don't nest phrases within one another is because that's kind of abstract. But
mhm.
also just that, yeah, their whole cognition is non-abstract. And to tell you the truth, there have been a lot of people in Brazil who are stewards of the Amazonians who haven't like that. That's gotten Everett in a lot of trouble. And you know, it pushes audiences in funny directions that frankly are a lot of why I wrote The Language Hoax. And so Everett, who I really do respect, I've written a book review of one of his books in the Times, which will show that I respect him, but he
Yeah,
tells a story in his spoken presentation of how with the Piraha, he went there originally as a missionary. He has since given up that frame of mind, but he went
right.
as a missionary. And he's telling them about Jesus. And they say, oh, well, you know, did you ever meet him? And then he says, no. And then they say, well, forget it. And everybody in the audience, I've seen this work on three audiences. Everybody laughs, and we're supposed to think, well, the Piraha, they've got their feet on the ground. You have to really show them something. But the truth is, that's showing that they are not open at all to the abstraction that Dan was putting forth. I'll bet you could get them to understand it, but we're supposed to sit there and think that they're somehow realer than us because they can't understand how you would celebrate somebody who's dead that you've learned about from the printed page. That worries me. I think that that's a little condescending to any group of Homo sapiens. And so, yeah, it's funny stuff, this take on the Piraha, although it does create fascinating articles like that one in the Times. That was '08, I think, and it definitely is a classic.
You circle back to Steven Pinker because in this other book of his, what does he call it? The Blank Slate.
Blank slate, yeah.
He has this argument about three mistakes that we make when we think, you know, what is it? The blank slate. You know, people are born and they can
Mm-hmm.
be shaped into anything. The noble savage, and this is the idea that the pre-civilizational
Yeah.
cultures had something pure and elevated about them that's been corrupted by the advent of the. And he thinks that this is a deeply wrong idea. And I can't remember what the third one is, but
Mm-hmm.
he sort of builds. And so you're saying Everett may be making a noble savage type mistake with respect to this group.
To be honest, yeah, and I think that he really does think that there is a nobility in this
Oh,
particular kind of savageness. But I think a lot of us are trained to that,
sorry to
and I
interrupt.
think that
Sorry to interrupt. I just
what?
remembered. I just remembered the third prong of Pinker's argument
Oh, go ahead.
in the
Yeah.
blank slate, which is the ghost in the machine, which is also relevant
Hmm.
here. The belief that there is some entity apart from the material that inhabits the human and perhaps other living beings, the soul, the spirit, or something like this, that is independent of or not completely determined by the physical substratum. The brain, the electrochemical
Exactly.
impulses in our bodies, and so forth and so on. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to
Exactly.
complete that thought. Yeah,
And see, that's important because it's one of those things. We can assume that the Piraha definitely make that thing that Pinker is considering a mistake. They definitely would, you would imagine that they would think that there's some kind of ghost in the machine, that there is some sort of spirit. And so, on the one hand, if you're going to read Pinker's blank slate and think, indeed, yes, it is a mistake to think that there is some sort of spirit, that there is something other than matter as opposed to mind, that's great. But then you can't then think of it as somehow romantic when a group of people living somewhere else are making that quote unquote mistake, and then you say, well, the world needs diversity and they're just different. That's a question that I think we educated Westerners are often not encouraged to confront. And it's a tricky one because you end up perhaps having to criticize people who live in a very different life than you do. But sometimes when we don't, I think we end up with condescension such as thinking that viciousness towards female people is a diversity as opposed to something that any group of people should be taught out of. There's a lot there. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up that third part. Definitely.
yeah, yeah. Okay, why don't we shift
I'd like to see if we
gears?
can make a transition from this to the other thing we were going to talk about. But
Well,
yeah,
I don't know
that's
if
right.
there's any connection or not, but maybe you could introduce this topic, which was going to be our main subject of discussion, based on our respective reactions to a piece that we saw now maybe 10 days ago, complaining about President Obama's being badly treated because he's a black man, and attributing his to the extent that it is a lackluster performance in office, attributing that to people's reaction to his race.
Well, it's interesting. I think in some moods, I'm going to wangle a transition that I actually feel.
Okay.
There is a fourth habit of mind that I think it's very easy for human beings to fall into, and I do not exert myself, depending on what the topic is, which is that in certain subjects, we train ourselves or we're trained to think that it must be A or B rather than something in between. We human beings have an awful lot of trouble with the intermediates. And I think that that is beautifully evidenced by the way the wise person today is supposed to think about Obama and racist attitudes towards him and his presidency. And so, what we're referring to, if I recall, is a piece by William Jelani Cobb, who
Yes,
is a black historian at, I hate to admit, I can't remember the exact, is it Southern Connecticut University? It's
I
one
actually
of the
don't know.
Connecticut
Okay.
in that state system. And he has been blogging for the New Yorker, and he wrote a piece which I think is typical of a piece that many people of his stature and age cohort and commitments have been writing, which is that it's clear now, the data are all in, that race has mattered in Obama's reception. And the implication is not just that race has played a part, although Professor Cobb certainly does indicate that it has played a part. He's not trying to be an extremist. But the implication of a lot of this work is that it's played such a part that really it would be safe to say that, as you put it, racism has interfered with Obama's ability to govern, racism against him. And that's what the main argument, very elegantly made in Jelani Cobb's blog, was. And I don't know how you feel about that. I think, for starters, we both know that there are racist attitudes towards the president. I mean, I think it would be kind of odd if there weren't. The question is, what effect have they had? What do you think?
Yeah. I think that given what we know about partisan division and sort of institutional implosion in Washington,
Hmm.
I'm talking about um, Mitch McConnell and Harry Reid and John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi and Tea Partiers and left-oriented activist interest in our politics. I'm talking about MSNBC versus Fox News. I'm talking about nonprofit fundraising efforts that are partisan and that end up running bad ads, against candidates whom they don't like, and so on and so forth. I'm saying, given what we know about the state of American politics, and about the degree of partisanship, I mean, how many really contested congressional districts are going to be up for contest when we have 435 separate elections for members of Congress in a few months? Most of those districts have been sewn up because they've been gerrymandered, this and that, and so on. So when you look at the full political landscape into which you have to fit the president's situation, the idea that antipathy toward him because of his race is a major factor in preventing anything from getting done in Washington seems silly to me, frankly. I mean, it seems like an anachronism, like a throwback to another era, like the same people, who were rolling around on the floor with joy in 2008 because our time had come. That is, they understood the election of this man whose father was from Kenya and whose mother was from Kansas to be a harbinger of a major turn of the wheel with respect to the elevation of the status of, quote, black people, close quote. Those very same silly people who don't understand a great deal about American politics and who are obsessed with race are now going to do a post-mortem on the 6 to 8 years of the Obama presidency through the same cloudy lens with which they viewed his ascendancy in the first place. I can't take them very seriously. Of course, he's not getting anything done. The reasons have very little to do with him being black and everything to do with the set of factors that I just got through initiating about the polarization of American politics. That's what I think.
Now, my question to you would be, I agree completely, but I also enjoy listening to the opposition because they feel that they're right. They would say that the partisanship has gotten so bad partly because a certain kind of white person doesn't like this quote-unquote uppity black man or black man in general having so much power. They just can't get used to it. And it's not extremists who are saying this. I remember Paul Krugman making one of the first most articulate statements along those lines. This is, New Yorker reading, Upper West Side cocktail party sorts of people. Would you say that they're mistaken? They would feel that they are quite correct. It has to be his color, partly. And when they say partly, they mean mostly.
Well, it's the mostly where I would disagree. I mean, I can't deny that his color is noticeable and to some people is deeply problematic. I mean, I am sure that you can, fill up hours with outtakes and, excerpts and whatnot from people who have evidenced in their reaction, their visceral negative reaction to the president, some manner of racism. I don't doubt that it's out there. Of course it's out there. There are some people who are never going to get used to the idea that a black man is president, that a black family is in the White House, and so on. But what I would say is that's a second order effect relative to the underlying major structural factors that are creating log jams and impasses in the deliberations of America's political institutions. And I would say that regardless of who the liberal Democrat was, who with a Democratic majority in the House and the Senate forced through and forced down the throats of the Republicans and the conservatives a major piece of social legislation like the Affordable Care Act, regardless of the color of that man or woman, there would have been a Tea Party reaction in 2010 against the overreach of government. And there would have been a deeply entrenched, led by William Crystal and other such operatives, movement to try to repeal, to, trim back, to limit, to frustrate the efforts to expand the American welfare state in this direction. By no
You
means do
are
I think the opposition to the welfare state, such as we see it from Republicans, is due to the fact that the president is black. I think that's ridiculous.
I think you are absolutely right. And there is something that I have posed to a lot of people, including my friends, where I have yet to hear a real response. And I think it does reveal that there's an extent to which we are trained to. No, that's not the right way to put it. It's at the point where saying that racism plays a part in something is one of the ways that we signal that we're moral people, and we're more interested in signaling that than we always are in grappling with how reality changes. And it's just like what you said. Suppose it were John Edwards, and the standard response now is, yeah, well, ha ha ha, and then you distract the conversation into talking about his fall. But that's not the point. Suppose none of that had happened, and John Edwards had become, and not unthinkable that that's what had happened, the
Right.
president. Now there he is with his lacquered hair, and I don't mean to be tacky, but let's imagine if Elizabeth Edwards stayed alive, and he or she would be a person who would be interested in being a very active first lady. She would have her opinions, etc. Those two people are the president and the first lady. And we're supposed to think that there would be no Tea Party because he was white. And people seem to not be able to get past the fact that, okay, racialized things have sometimes been said about the president by people who should have known better. But if it were Edwards, it would be other things. You would have things like hillbilly. I remember Ann Coulter calling him a faggot. There would be all sorts of. He was a person who, if you wanted to make him a laughable figure, it would not be difficult. It would be the exact same thing. And that means that has race played a part with Obama's reception? Sure, why would it not? Has it been enough of a part that we're supposed to be shaking our heads that this is the way we knew it was going to be all along? I just don't see the evidence. I'm not sure anybody else does either if they really look at the facts.
Yeah, so we agree about that. So now how about this?
What about Clinton, Glenn?
Oh,
Don't wouldn't you say that how many people felt about him was also the exact same thing, that we're beginning to forget what that was like because it was 20 years ago?
no, that's another example of the same thing that I was saying. I mean, Bill Clinton, I mean, they were accused of murdering Vince Foster and covering it up. Bill Clinton's
Yeah.
escapades and the state house in Little Rock, Arkansas, became the fodder for the right wing press. I remember because I was a right winger at that time,
Hmm.
reading
Yeah.
the American Spectator with relish, because every new escapade about what the state troopers were revealing about Clinton's tryst with this or that. I don't even remember their names now. The Bimbo Parade, excuse me, but that's how it was depicted
Paula
at the time.
Jones,
Oh,
right.
Paula Jones, yeah, and
Hmm.
then there was another one, could suck a tennis ball through a garden hose. That's what Clinton
I forget about that one.
easily forgotten. Perhaps it should be. I shouldn't have mentioned it. Anyway. Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Clinton was some kind of scumbag, hillbilly, Untermenschen, lower class person who didn't deserve to be in the White House, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, they did that
Yeah.
to him.
People hated his guts. Yeah. And
But
now
you know
here people
what?
are walking.
He was a
Go ahead.
pretty effective president. I mean, that's the other point that I wanted to come to. The point that I wanted to come to is that whereas Bill Clinton was a pretty effective occupant of that office, Barack Obama has not been, and that's the elephant in the room. That's the thing that looms behind everything else. That is failure. Okay,
Hmm.
failure didn't get it done. Okay.
Hmm.
Now that has to be accounted for. See, so this to me, this is the subtext here that we have an African American. He rises to the highest office in the land. He serves for 8 years. He gets reelected. That certainly is success. Having not gotten elected would have been a disaster for the narrative about black ascendancy. But now you're confronted with the performance of the occupant in the office, and I mean by any measure, it ain't going to be an A. It's probably not even going to be a B minus. So now, how do you reckon that? Now, trotting out the racism argument as a justification for the failure to perform. Okay, that's what I
Hmm.
see going on here. And that deeply troubles me, not only because I think it's wrong as a matter of, historical interpretation and factual analysis, but because I think it is a reflex that we African Americans sometimes have, of hiding from the evidence that the world is giving us about the extent to which we have or have not measured up to whatever the task might be. And I know I'm going to get into trouble for saying that, but I'm okay with that. I mean, this is really a hard job. I grant you that. It's a hard job. There's no doubt about
And
it.
in very hard times.
It's terrible times. He inherited this terrible financial situation, the crisis and all that. That's true. The world has gone haywire. That's not Obama's fault that the world's going to hell in a handbasket, but he's the guy in charge of the helm. He's the guy. So if stuff doesn't go right, if stuff doesn't get reacted to deftly and with brilliance and with perception and with good effect, it redounds to his detriment. And people are, to the extent that they trot out the racism argument, hiding from that, and they ought not to do so, in my opinion.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that I would disagree with you on B minus. I would say given what he was up against, he will qualify in the long term as a B president. I wouldn't call it B plus, but that B minus, maybe there's grade inflation that challenges my view, but B minus implies that he really kind of screwed up. And I think, given certain foreign policy victories, given that the Health Care Act passed it all, I would give him a B.
Okay.
But you're right that the idea that that racism kept him from being an A means that you're not evaluating him according to the content of his character, because the truth of the matter is
Right.
it wouldn't have been a magic bullet, but he's not an especially gregarious person, as opposed to, say, Clinton, who notoriously is. And to tell the truth, I think Barack Obama has evidenced himself to not be an especially gifted politician outside of being able to get elected. One does not see a political genius there. He's all right, but in terms of what he is as an individual, black individual or not, there were limitations far beyond how Mitch McConnell and Senator Joe Wilson saying "you lie" and all of the other ones feel about him as a black man. And I see it as progress that so many people are nevertheless so dedicated. And I think of the people saying this as white as well as black, that it's all about his race, or enough about his race that nothing else needs to be talked about very much, which effectively means saying that it's all about race. If that's how educated white people now tend to think, then we really are much closer to the mountaintop than we thought, because that means that these are people who are willing to cry racism even against the facts. They're willing to turn off the kind of analysis that they usually do about other things in order to arrive at this particular conclusion. We've come a long, long way, which is why I can't be angry at this verdict the way it's clearly going to come out, which is that Obama was hobbled because people didn't like that he was black. But I really don't think it holds up. And in 50 years, when people are outside of our particular imperatives, I think that historians will see it more our way. We are now contrary. I don't think that this view will be contrary in 50 years. But it can be interesting to watch it at this point.
Okay, so you think,
And
I'm sorry to interrupt, you think the view is wrong, but you're nevertheless happy to see that so many whites are embracing it because that means that
definitely,
they've progressed beyond the old.
definitely. Because if you think about, say, 1967, you're watching Martin Luther King on Meet the Press, and they don't like him. It's at the point we tend to forget that Martin Luther King was looked down on by cocktail party educated white
He
people.
was a troublemaker. He was a rabble
Troublemaker.
rouser. He was a rabble rouser and a troublemaker. Yeah.
Wasn't getting it done. And he's on Meet the Press, and even they don't like him. It's an interview where he's being interviewed with the attitude today that Ted Cruz would be interviewed on the same show. It's like,
Nice
kind
point.
of make a case for yourself, Mr. King. And
Exactly.
then he was assassinated, and there was a new view. That was how white people felt. I was alive by then. It wasn't that long ago. And today, those same sorts of people will not hear that the Tea Party is about anything but racism. That is a pendulum that swung too far in the other direction, but isn't that the way change always happens? And the change is messy. So yeah, it's there. And as far as black people who feel that way, that's a whole different set of issues. But again, the pendulum has swung in a certain direction, and it will come back to the middle. Have you ever had an argument with anybody about this in a live setting? I have, which is why I'm very live about it.
Yeah, I have broken off the discussions when it got into this territory because I've been afraid of offending or injuring my relationships with people because people feel very strongly about it, and because I don't want to be called a hater, which is what you end up getting called in certain circles of African Americans anyway. If you have anything critical to say about the president, oh,
Hmm.
you're jealous because he's a black man, he's president, and you're just whatever you are.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah.
you can't stand the idea that a black man's going to be successful. So this is just black people pulling black people down and things like that. And I haven't
Right.
I
Right.
haven't wanted to encounter that kind of ad hominem, and so have not pressed the point. In the safety of my conversation with you and blogging heads, I can express my full opinion.
Well, I appreciate it because it's mine too, which is officially, despite whatever kind of mail we're going to get for this. My feeling is, has racism played a part in Barack Obama's reception? Yes, but not enough to matter. So, yes, there are all sorts of psychological tests you can do on people. You can look at comments in blogs, all sorts of things. And yes, you will find that his color does affect how people have thought of him. And you might even find the same thing in terms of certain Congress people. But really, the question is, has it mattered? Is it something that deserves as much ink as we spill over it, as opposed to perhaps more mundane and less sensational aspects of why the country is hard to govern at this point? And I just don't think that the racism has mattered that much. And I would say that if you're going to put a number on it, I would say that it's far below 33.3%.
Okay.
It's one of a great many things. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that. I mean, these numbers don't mean very much, but yeah, I agree with what you said. What I want to say in addition to that is racism might have played a much more important factor in negative reactions to the president if the president had behaved in a more radically progressive way while in office. For instance, if the president had made the plight of people of color in the poor districts of our country a major domestic policy concern from the start, too many black men in prison, schools that don't work in the inner cities, which cut off the bottom rung of the ladder of opportunity, the subtle forms of discrimination that continue to inhibit, police brutality and excessive, etc. We could go on down the list. Okay, if he had done that, if the president had said, we're a friend of Israel, but we're a friend of the Israel that resists the domination and occupation of other peoples. We're a friend of the Israel that is really and truly consistent with the democratic values that we embrace, and not the right wing expansionist settler, blah 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 blah. If the president had said, those guys up on Wall Street, the fat cats, the one that almost brought us down as an economy and who still have their mansions and their golden parachutes and whatnot, they are my enemy and I'm going to take them down. If he had done stuff like that, he would have encountered fierce resistance. There would be people really trying to impeach him. And there would be an anti-Obama rhetoric that would have been fueled by racism. Why does he favor his own kind, et cetera, et cetera? He's not truly an American, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, we did hear
Mm-hmm.
some of that, but not very much of it. If he had actually done some of the things
Mm-hmm.
that some of us think when a black person rises on the shoulders of Martin Luther King to the highest office in the land they need to do, then he well might have encountered some racial animus of the sort that would justify Professor Cobb and others' concerns. He didn't do any of those things.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm going to say in what may be our closing,
Yeah.
I have it on good authority that you and I know that there are various journalists who wish that he had been a blacker president in that way. And for them, that's a mark against Obama's presidency that he has been so, as they say, circumspect about race, and that the best he's probably going to have done is this My Brother's Keeper initiative. And I have it on good authority that one of those people was among a big passel of journalists invited to the White House, and that this person addressed our president with criticism as to his not having been a black enough president. And apparently, when it's off the record, the president is capable of giving as good as he gets.
I don't doubt it.
And he very politely ripped this individual a new one. And so that is what I have on good authority, is how he actually feels about that charge. And I would agree with him. And I would agree with you that if he had done it, it really would have been antithetical to his interests, whether we like it or not. And for him to have failed for that reason would have been a bad move. He had to deal with the world as it is. And then there's My Brother's Keeper, where the new criticism is that it's about men and therefore not a good policy because it ignores the problems of women. You have anything on that? Because there's a question. Why do you have to aim it at black men as opposed to black people? It's considered ahead of the curve to say that's not right.
No,
Why ignore the problems the girls have?
I would say there is an issue with respect to men, and there's nothing wrong with identifying it. If it were the only thing you were doing, then the criticism would be appropriate. One hopes that as the Obama, I mean, he's a relatively young man, he will be a former president for a lot longer than he was president. As the Obama story unfolds, that we'll see, and Michelle and Barack, we'll see a full, range of enterprises and initiatives, and women won't be left out of that. I don't think I mean, if you ask, let's take the violence in Chicago, the shootings and the killings, the people who are getting killed. Well, what's that? That's those are guys going around with guns who are in gangs. If you look at various social indicators, mortality, morbidity, imprisonment, school failure, and so forth, you see real huge gender disparities. If you think about the structure of the family and the consequences of that for child rearing and so on, the impact on boys of fatherlessness may be, I say this as a social scientist somewhat speculatively, I don't know that the evidence is determinative here, more debilitating for the boys in terms of their development and able to achieve some kind of right living than it is for the girls in such households. So that you could identify a problem as, what's happening to our black guys, our men of color, and focus on it. If it were the only thing you were doing, I think you'd be susceptible to criticism. But to have singled it out, I don't think is necessarily wrong. I think it could be justified.
I would agree with that. I think that there is something going on with the boys and with the men, which, if solved, would have a major impact on the whole community. But I just wondered how you felt about that. But
I
we've
want
almost hit 45.
Yeah, no, let me just say
And
something
so,
else, just very quickly, John,
sure.
which is about biting the head off. It could have been Tavis Smiley or somebody. You didn't name the person. I don't know who it is. But it was a Tavis Smiley-like person who might have ventured in a private meeting at dinner with journalists at the White House to criticize the president for not being
It
black enough.
is it is complete. Yeah, I do not want to reveal the identity of the
No
person
problem.
because I have it confidentially.
I
However,
see.
it was a person with views of that kind. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the president gave as good as he got. And I can envision that. To tell you the truth or to confess, I've often had a daydream about meeting up with Barack Obama one of these days. Maybe he comes to Brown to give a lecture. I'm the distinguished professor or whatever, and I get to have some
And you
kind of,
get to, yeah,
and I
right.
get to say, why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? And it's not just about black people. It's about these global issues too, where I feel that, being a warmonger is not the right ideal and American militarism deserves to be criticized and so forth and so on. And
Hmm.
I've actually, in this premonition, in this kind of daydream that I've had, shudder at what I know is going to be the withering response of the man who was, after all, the leader of the free world, okay, the commander in chief of
Exactly.
the largest military in human history, against me, a
Hmm.
guy who's never gotten out of the ivory tower or off of a campus and never led or had to do anything. And I'm sure
Hmm.
I'm sure I will lose that argument.
Which means the man can take care of himself. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose he can. He did get himself elected president of the United States after all.
Yeah.
Twice.
Yeah. I would like to see that one day, Glenn. And that could actually happen. I would like to watch that interaction.
Okay, well, we'll see. Take care, John. Good to
Yeah.
talk to you.
Glenn, I'll talk to you very soon. Have a
Right
good
on.
one.
Bye bye.